Hey everybody, welcome to the second video. In this video, we're going to talk about the second topic, the second major issue that Eitan and I have been thinking about in terms of the scope and sequence of our history curriculum more broadly, and that is how we can help our students best develop their analytical thinking skills, primarily through analyzing sources. As historians, as history teachers, we all know that sources are the key to understanding the past, and that's something that we want to make sure our students understand, not just from a very simplistic point of view, but we want our students to be able to analyze sources in a sophisticated way. We want our students to become amateur historians. We want them to look at a source and to be able to create an argument from the sources that they're studying. One of the primary objectives we have is to make sure that our students understand that history isn't simply a narrative, isn't simply a story. And so we want our students to be able to read a source, to be able to analyze the material they have in front of them in a meaningful way. And to that end, earlier in the summer, I sent around a tool which I thought could be useful in helping students analyze primary and secondary sources, and that's the tool you see on the screen, Understanding Primary and Secondary Sources. This is a Google form with a variety of categories and topics and questions that we want students to consider and think about as they're analyzing the source to help really refine their critical thinking and analytical skills. A lot of you looked at this this Google form, gave me some fantastic feedback, some fantastic ways of thinking about how we can tailor this in a meaningful way for the various grades and for the various sections. And over the past few weeks, I've gone back to the drawing board a little bit to think about how we can best ensure that our students are able to understand what they're looking for, how we can best relate to them, what we want them to do in the context of analyzing the source, and to refine in the best way possible their critical thinking skills. And so actually over the past couple of weeks, moved away from this Google form to, I think, what is going to be, from the teacher's standpoint and from the student's standpoint, a more useful tool. And that's a document that I shared with you a couple of minutes ago. The document is titled Student's Explanation, Understanding, and Interpreting Sources. I'm going to bring that document up on the screen right now. Here we go. There we go. Good. This is a source. This is a doc, that I shared with you a couple of minutes ago. It has a number of different features that I'd like to go over with you over the course of the next little while. And I think this is the best way for us to impart to our students why analyzing sources is so important and the key aspects that we want our students to develop in refining their critical thinking skills. What you have in this document are really three different things, and we're going to go through these three things together. First, it's an introduction. It's a one-page introduction that you can see here. An introduction to why analyzing sources are so important, why they are the key and the backbone for historians and for what we do in history class. We're not going to read this together. You can read it to yourselves. I actually imagine reading this with my students on the second day of class, especially with a 10th grade or 11th grade class that already had the introduction to what a primary, to what a secondary source is. In the 9th grade classroom, I would actually do this and read this with them after we talk a little bit about what a primary source is, what a secondary source is, which is really one of the first series of lessons that we all utilize at the beginning of the year. This is taken from the AP overview of the AP World History curriculum. I didn't write this. I'm not going to claim I wrote this, but I sort of copied and pasted from that. We'll just read together. I'll just highlight this last paragraph here so you can follow along with me in the document. Again, I share this document with you. It's called Student's Explanation, Understanding, and Interpreting Sources. You can find it in the shared folder of your Google Drive. If you can't find it, and I'm happy to share it with you again. But I'd like to just focus on this last paragraph here because it sets up the second aspect of the source. So again, this last paragraph down, here. Good. Okay. The document below identifies topics and questions that will help you make productive inquiries as you analyze source material. The questions guide you so that you can extract useful information, make supportable inferences, and draw appropriate conclusions from the sources, all of which are necessary when students use primary sources to create a historical argument. And what follows the next couple of pages are 7 key features to help analyze and understand sources. What I did in essence was I took the 7 topics that were part of the original Google form. And instead of putting it in a form fashion, simply added here, wrote down the key feature with key questions, and then why these questions are important for understanding the source. And what this does is a couple of things. First of all, it introduces to the students the key features that we want them to focus on in analyzing a source. And it provides to them the key questions that they need to be thinking about when they're reading a source. It also provides a justification why this specific feature, why these specific questions are important to ask. And so again, the 7 features you see here are the same features that were introduced in the original Google form, in the original tool that we shared with you earlier this summer. But what this does is it allows you, the teacher, to sort of say, okay, I want at this point in time of the year to focus on this key feature, where I want to focus on these 2 or 3 key features. And it allows you to tell the students, okay, go back to the explanation, look at the key feature, look at the contents of sources, look at feature number 1, look at the key questions, look at the, and think about those questions and answer those questions as you look through a source. Now, the third part of this document, which we'll get to, is an annotation tool, a tool that students can use to annotate a document using these 7 key features and answering these key questions. We'll get to that in a minute. But what you have here again are the 7 key features, so contents of source, key questions, and why are these questions important for understanding the source. And so just to, again, highlight the first one here, why are these questions important for understanding the source? Documents of every type are incomplete. They may consist merely of the best information available at a given time and place. They may be limited by the time or resources available to the creator. Valid interpretation can only be based on an awareness of precisely what a document says and what it does not say. Very often in class, we'll tell our students, okay, so what does the document say? And instead of just giving them a very broad and general question, the questions here are a little more focused. In a few sentences, summarize the contents of the source. What is the main point, argument, ideas the source is trying to make? And we're telling our students this is important for a specific reason. This is important not just because I'm asking you to summarize something, but it's important for understanding the historical past. Again, the way that I'm going to, I think, approach this is at the beginning of the year, I'm going to go through this with my students and go through the 7 key features and tell them, look, we're going to, at different times, focus on different features. We may focus on content and formats for a given point of time, and then tell them, look, whenever you're reading a source, this is going to be second nature. You're going to have to identify the format. You're going to have to identify the content. So again, as you look through the documents here, you'll see different questions and different justifications as to why this feature is necessary and why these questions are necessary. So the second feature is the format of the source. The third feature is the historical context of the source. The fourth feature is the authorship of the source. Who composed the source? What is the author's relationship to the historical event being addressed? The fifth feature is the author's purpose in creating the source. Why did the author create the source? Why has the source survived to the present? The sixth feature is the audience of the source. Who is the source created for? How might the audience have affected the content? How might the audience affected the reliability? And finally, number 7, the limitations of the source. Again, you as the teacher can introduce all of these features to your students at the beginning of the year. You can introduce a number of them, but you have this information in front of you now in a very usable way from the context of asking key questions, but also providing a justification as to why this is important in developing analytical skills, critical thinking skills. Good. Now, the third aspect of the document that you have is actually implementing the sort of the analysis, the use of these key features. So instead of going back and using the form every single time you go through a source, and the form is a long form, and one of the pieces of feedback that I got from many of you is that it's just too long to do every single time with a source, and many of the features are really not that usable for my class, and it may be cumbersome to create a new form every single time with every single source. And so to that end, I started to think about how we can sort of create a shorthand for analyzing a source using these key features. And so to that end, and this is the third aspect of the document starting on page 5, is an annotation schematic to help students, to give students clear instructions as to how they are going to analyze a source using the key features we want them to develop, we want them to focus on. So just to read the introductory paragraph here, and again, this is on page 5 of the document, in order to facilitate the analysis and understanding of primary sources based on the 7 features above, and instead of using the understanding primary and secondary sources tool, students and teachers may want to use the annotation scheme below. These annotations are meant to be made directly on the source itself. Primarily, if students are analyzing a source, they are provided via an electronic medium. The annotation scheme can be used for printed sources, but students will need access to different color markers. The annotation scheme presented here is not meant to answer each key question of the 7 features above. And this is, I think, an important aspect. Rather, the annotations provide an efficient, active, and effective way of analyzing the source from different points of view. And what you have coming next are the 7 key features with some of the key questions and ways to annotate the source to answer the key questions. Now again, each of the questions that I included above in the second part of the source, included in the 7 key features, not all of these questions are included in the annotation scheme. And that's done for a couple of reasons. First, to make the annotation scheme a little bit easier, but also because some of these questions are interesting, but they're not necessarily vital for understanding a source and for providing for a good analysis of a source. Now, you can very easily incorporate the questions that are not included in the annotation scheme, but are included in the documents above. You can include those questions if you want to in the annotation scheme for a more advanced class. So for each of the key features, what I provide here for is, first of all, key questions. Again, all these questions are taken from the features above, and an annotation, a way of telling the students, this is how you're going to annotate the source, and this is how I am going to know you understand or are attempting to understand these key questions. So what I've done actually, and we're going to toggle back between sources, between documents here, I did a mock-up of what a source will look like if you're using the annotation scheme. So let's look at the key feature number 1. This is the content of sources. And there are 2 questions when we're asking students to tackle the issue of the content of the source. What is the main points, arguments, ideas the source is trying to make? Please limit your response to 1 or 2 sentences. Now, what I did here was provided 2 different annotations. Annotation 1, highlight in green the main points, arguments, ideas of the source. Please do not make more than 5 highlights exhibiting the main points of the source. And secondly, the second annotation in answering the question is at the end of the source, under the heading Contents of Source, provide a 1 to 2 sentence summary of the main point, argument, idea that the source is trying to get across. So, 2 annotations in trying to answer this question. What does that look like? Now, if we turn to this source here, and let me just bring it up for you guys to see. Here we go. Good. This is a source that I use with my honors class at the beginning of the year. Martin Luther addressed to the Christian nobility from 1520. It's a long source. It's almost 2 pages. It's a source that I think is extremely important in understanding the development of the Reformation, of Lutheranism, and understanding the importance of Luther himself. And so this is a source that I have used in the past with my 10 grade with my 10 honor students. And you can see that I've mocked up the source already in different colors and let's just go through some of them so we can all understand what we're looking at. So you can see in green, I've highlighted in green the different parts of the source which I think are the most important for understanding the content of the source. And so again, you can see here, look through the source, there are a couple of annotations that are made in green. So to that end, I have fulfilled, and going back to the annotation scheme itself, I fulfilled the first annotation, highlighting green the main 5 points, arguments, ideas of the source. Now, I think I highlighted 6, but that's okay. The second annotation, at the end of the source, under the heading Contents of Source, provide a 1 to 2 sentence summary of the main point, argument, idea that the source is trying to get across. So if we go back to the source that I've mocked up for us to use, you can see at the end of the source I provided, under the heading Contents of Source, a summary. In this source, Martin Luther defined for the first time the signature doctrine of the priesthood of all believers in the two kingdoms, as well as offering a sustained critique of the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. In a variety of ways in this source, Luther continues his sustained questioning of the regnant religious structure of his age while calling the people of the Holy Roman Empire to rebel against this reality. I don't expect students to be able to write all of that necessarily, but it provides, again, a sense of the content and the meaning of what the source is trying to say. So to fulfill the second part of that annotation. Okay, now let's go back to the annotation scheme to look at the second question of the first feature. And the second question, and again, it's up to you to decide what you want your students to use. If you want them just to focus on the contents, then use this key feature. You don't have to use the rest of the other 6 key features. But if you want to, all of this is there for you to use. The second key feature, the second key question in the first feature. What is the source? What of the source's content is usable by a historian to make an historical argument? Now, this is a more advanced question that you may not necessarily want a 9A or a 9 advanced class to answer, and even a 9th grade honors class to answer, but you may expect a 10th grade class to answer. And so the annotation to answer this question is the following. Highlight in green and underline the parts of the source that historians can use to make a historical argument. Note, do not highlight the entire source, only the key aspects that you think historians can use to make a historical argument. Now, if we go back to my mocked up source, we can see here that there are a couple of sections that I underlined. Beginning of the source here, the distress and misery which oppress all ranks of Christendom have moved not me alone, but everybody to cry aloud for help. This it is that now compels me to cry out and call upon God to send down his Spirit upon someone who shall reach out a hand to this wretched people. This provides a sense of why Luther is doing what he's doing. It provides a historical, it provides to the historian a sense of why Luther is taking this step. And again, another sentence here that's highlighted. So this, I think, highlights, not funny. This, I think, draws attention to the fact that I, as a student, have answered all of the necessary annotations. Now, again, going back to the annotation schematic, each of the key features has key questions and annotations. Some of them have more questions than others. The format of the source. Key questions. What is the format of the source? Archaeological, artifact, textual, image, art, newspaper, article, etc. Annotation. Highlight in blue the format of the source as it appears in the text itself. Now, let's say, and students may come to you and say, oh, in the source itself, I can't find anything that will directly answer the question of the format of the source. It doesn't tell me, the source itself doesn't tell me what it is. In that case, and this is what I've done with each of these key features, if the format of the source is not apparent or it is not stated clear in the source itself, at the end of the source under the heading Format of Source, write what you think the format of the source is, so that students, if they can't necessarily find a way to highlight something, they can at the very end of the source simply write in a very, very clear way what they think the format of the source is. Now, just to go back to the mocked up source, we can see here that in this source, the title of the source, Martin Luther address to the Christian nobility. Now, I highlighted that in blue. What does an address mean? Is it a speech? Is it something else? At the end of the source, I think I added this here, format of source. Right. I added another annotation at the end because from my point of view, reading it, address doesn't really give me a full sense of what the source is, what the format of the source is. So I added here, while the title notes that this is an address to the Christian nobility, the text reads like an open letter sent by Luther. Provides a little more context, a little more background as to what is the format of this source. Okay, let's go back just very quickly to the annotation scheme. And we're not going to go through each of the key features. But each of the key features has a specific way of annotation. And it's a useful way, again, of telling students, okay, when you're thinking about this key feature, the content, the context, the authorship, this is how you're going to identify what that actually is. And you're going to allow me as a teacher to see that you understand what you're talking about. What you have, therefore, is a very good reference point. And this is something that I plan on coming back to almost every day with my students, so that by the second quarter, by the second half of the year, it's going to be second nature to the students when they're reading a source. And I tell them they're focusing on content, they're focused on context, or if I'm telling them I want you to annotate the entire the source using all 7 features, they know what they have to do. My plan is to put this up on Haiku, to give it an entirely separate Haiku page so that students can easily access this information and access the annotation tool in a very simple way. Now, just to be clear, and not all of us necessarily know how to do this. You have to have students will have to have in front of them the source electronically. And almost all of my sources are on Google Drive or a PDF reader. And to that end, it makes it very easy to highlight and to annotate the source. To go back to the mocked up source very, very quickly, if you don't know how to highlight, it's very simple. And I'll just show all of you. If you were to highlight this paragraph, contents of source, if we were to just highlight the paragraph, we select the paragraph, and then if you go up to the top here by the bar, you click where it says the text color, and you can shift between text and highlights. And here you have the different colors and highlight the different colors. Now, there's one last aspect that I want to mention. So let's just briefly go back to the annotation tool itself. To look at together, and that is the historical context of the source. Excuse me, not the historical context, but the, the author's purpose of creating the source. So here, if you have students answer the question, why did the author create the source? We want students to highlight in red the part of the source that explains why the author created the source. If there's no clear indication why the author created the source, in the source itself, at the end of the source, under the heading author's purpose, briefly write why you think the author created the source. And this is something this last part is what I wanted to focus on. If you have already highlighted the part of the source that satisfies the question, create a comment on the side of the document indicating that this part also satisfies the question of the author's purpose in creating the source. Meaning, by the time, if you're asking students to highlight various parts of the source and you're asking them to do features 1 through 4, by the time they get to feature 5, they may have already highlighted the part of the source that satisfies this question. And what you can do, therefore, is ask students to add a comment on the side of the source to show that this specific piece of the source also satisfies this question, this feature. So how do you do that? If you go back to the source itself, you can see, let me just bring the source back up. You can see I've already added that annotation. You can see here that I've highlighted this first sentence in green here because, and added a comment that this also satisfies the question of the author's purpose in creating the source, which it does. Now, how do you add a comment? It's very simple. You select the part of the source that you want highlighted. Again, let's say this is the part of the source. You right-click on the piece that you highlighted, and you click comment. And there, you will have a comment come up, a comment box, which links directly to this piece of the source. Now, this annotation tool is a little complicated. All of the questions and all of the annotations are a little bit complicated. It's going to take, I think, some time for you as the teacher to really get your head around it. I think it's very useful, and I think it can be useful in creating, again, a shared vocabulary and language for ourselves, but also for our students. And again, it's up to you as the teacher to decide what features, what key historical questions you want the students to be asking when they're analyzing sources. So my suggestion is, over the next couple of weeks, play with this a little bit. Pick a source that you use in your class at the beginning of the year. Annotate it by yourself. See if it comes easily to you. I'm going to be using this with my students, again, primarily in the 10th grade. And I would love to hear your feedback. I think this is a good way, again, of giving to students the key questions we want them to focus on and helping develop their analytical skills, their critical thinking skills. So I'd love to hear your feedback. I'd love to hear suggestions and ways to focus on this. I think when we get back to school in a couple of weeks, and in the meetings that we'll have before the school year begins, we'll come back to this. We'll do some sources together, and we'll talk about how we can best implement this tool within our history classrooms. So for now, I hope everyone has a great rest of the summer. Please be in touch, and I look forward to hearing from you. All right, bye-bye, everybody.